Tamara, thank you so much for sitting down with me. I can't wait to catch up with you. It's been a while since we've been together in Minnesota, but you had a big conference, and I'm horribly rented here that I missed that. A few things before we get rolling. My name is Andrew Rose. I love doing these webinars. I invite my friends in. I know that maybe at the end of its lifetime, 20 or 25 people may watch this or acted upon it, but it's always fun to sit down and catch up with my friends and share this information with everyone else out there. And I'm so happy to have Tamara Nelsen here. I'm sorry that Allison is not in the box here for us to celebrate her making that introduction initially. And Tamara and I've had a lot of fun interacting together. But at this point in time, there is one, I'd like for you to talk a little bit about who you are and how you came to be in this position here. I do want you to touch upon a famous quarterback that you may have met in college.
Oh yeah, John Elway was a quarterback at Stanford. I think his dad was still the coach maybe my first year there, and literally ran into was almost what happened. There was a student union that was pretty quiet in the morning, and I was coming around the northwest corner of it, and John Elway was kind of coasting on his moped with like coffee in one hand and a donut, his hand on the thing, or coffee and a donut in one hand. And he came around the corner and we literally just about hit. And the one thing I will never forget, because of course, like, first of all, I was super annoyed that I almost got hit. Then when I saw who it was, I was like, wow, he's a lot bigger than I thought. And then because he very politely said, oh, I am so sorry. I'm so glad I didn't hit you. Are you okay? And I was like, yep. And I just smiled and walked away. But yeah, that was my close encounter with John Elway.
That's amazing. Well, let me ask you this. I mean, why'd you go to Stanford in the first place? I mean, obviously it's a spectacular university, but there's a lot of great schools around the country, and it seems like you got more of a Midwestern vibe to you than a California vibe, but I
tell
be
you
wrong.
now that I've been, I always say to people, it's because everywhere I went was at one time called the farm, or was a working farm, but that really only I learned that after I left all three institutions. The other thing I learned after leaving all three was that they all had a motto of enter to learn, leave to serve, which is, I can't tell you in Latin, but so Shattuck St. Mary's in southern Minnesota. I went to boarding school, and they were obviously interested in getting their young people into a really good university, because that's how everyone judges boarding schools, right? So my brother and I and another friend from Minnesota all went to Stanford, and which is also called the farm. Shattuck St. Mary's was a working farm at one point, so was Stanford. And then I did my MBA at Virginia Tech, which also had a good agricultural sense. Stanford, I think the thing is, Andrew, it was all happenstance. So I applied to all of these East Coast schools because I had been in Maine for a summer teaching at a camp, or being a counselor at a camp called Pine Island and off an island in Waterville, Maine, near Waterville. And I had applied to Bowdoin and Dartmouth and, all the East Coast schools, Middlebury, Colby, and a lot of them were having difficulties. It was 1980. There were difficulties financially, so they would contact you back and say, congratulations, you've been accepted, but we have no financial aid. And we had 6 kids, 3 in college. My dad was a plumber, so you can imagine. First, my brother and I were the first kids in the family to go to college. My father only went to the 8th grade in high school. So my brother was at Stanford. He had applied all early decision to East Coast schools like Harvard and Yale, and he ended up at Stanford. So my brother was like, well, you should come to Stanford. Why don't you at least apply? It's really pretty. They have palm trees. You can wear sundresses all year long. You just have to wear a down coat over in the winter because it's super cold in the morning. And I was like, okay, send me an application. So he sent me an application in March. I filled it out in pencil. My one-word description for myself was hard-working, which I'm sure any grammar geek would have thrown me right off the application list, but I got in. I know 12,000 people applied for 1,100 spots, and they were foolish enough to give one to me.
Yeah, but you're immensely smart, to be honest with you. We all know this, and I'm sure you had SATs or ACT scores just off the charts, that genius level stuff.
Maybe ACT, but not SAT. Yeah, no, but it was great. And it was, so much that I ended up kind of falling into ag and food there. I did the world history courses, and then I did World Hunger course that I taught with a couple of other grad students. And then it was a student-led class. And then I took some food economics courses. And then they had they used to have kind of an institute, a school within a school that they called food and agricultural studies or something. And I did some work with those folks. So yeah, really neat course, a different climate entirely. Lots of different things going on in California at that time in the 80s. Water issues have been forever, a water climate regulatory. So it was a good training ground for future agricultural work.
It sure was. That certainly leads us to the next page here of my question. So after college, obviously, I mean, is the MBA at Virginia Tech a tell for the work that you did in DC? Would that happen at that point in time?
Yeah,
And talk about how you got to DC and
sure.
maybe share some of the things that you did there.
Sure. So I went from Stanford back to Minnesota. I was at the time applying for a Fulbright or Rotary scholarship, and I was a little unclear as if I'd go over to Germany and study and work on my languages more, or if I'd do some class at the U of M. And I found out pretty quickly you don't get financial aid for graduate school unless you have one of those scholarship programs, because I already had a bachelor's. So I worked for 2-3 years in electronics and computer for a firm here in Minnesota that worked with a lot of companies in California and Colorado and Minnesota, like Control Data and IBM. And as I was doing that, I was kind of really missing mostly the international side of my background, because I studied international relations and I studied Cold War politics and economics. So I was like, so I had some good friends that were retired 4-star and 3-star generals out in DC, and they kept telling me, you know, your background, you really should be out here in DC. And so I moved out to Washington, D.C. and got a job with the National Center for Food and Ag Policy, which was started by the Kellogg Foundation. And it was at another think tank in D.C. called Resources for the Future. So I had the resource, environment, ag side all in one office suite. And then we were in the same building with the National Wildlife Federation, Sierra Club, World Wildlife Fund, USAID, a bunch of others. So it was super great field to put some sprouts down, and I did mostly agricultural and food policy for 3 years, and then I went more into the trade and international marketing side, and that's when I decided I needed to get an MBA, because the word on the street was you're only ever going to be an administrative assistant unless you get a master's degree. I self-paid then my MBA, much like I self-paid my Stanford degree with financial aid. And I forgot that part of the story, that Stanford is aid blind. So when my brother was already at Stanford and I applied back before I went to DC, they base it on your family's income, number of kids in college and all that. And so we got a really nice deal from Stanford. So that was very wonderful of their trustees. So yeah, in Washington and Virginia Tech's a great school. They have a Northern Virginia branch, School of Business. So got to work during the day and go to school at night.
I mean, I guess that sort of begs the question then, on Saturdays, who do you pull for?
Well, that's a great question. So most of my fan days in sports have been destroyed by how I felt the team underperformed or didn't. So my Vikings fandom died in the 70s, mid 70s, when we, I think, almost 3 times got close to being at the Super Bowl or nearly there, and we were either wiped out by the Steelers or whatever. So I do not watch professional football, although my husband and I are a little bit on a streak this year. If we watch the Vikings just for a few minutes and then we go downstairs, they usually win. So now everybody we know has us watching the Vikings for a few minutes and then leaving. On the football team, I was studying for midterms during the big game against Berkeley back in 1980-81, when the band was on the field. Do you remember the one where the band is on the field and they run into the trumpet player, who I knew, by the way? And that was sort of disgusting to me. You know, I didn't really care if the band was just having fun or they were drinking or whatever, why they were on the field. But it seemed to me that it kind of wrecked my team's chances. So severe disappointment, although I will say everywhere I've lived, I've tended to be a fan of the local team. So when I lived in California, I was a 49ers fan and we did go to the Super Bowl. And when I lived in Washington, D.C., I was a Redskins fan and we did go to the Super Bowl. I've been in Minnesota now for 4 years and it's not working, but it's getting closer. And on the college side, I don't cheer for a team, but on Saturday I'll be cheering for the University of Minnesota Gophers because I've been invited to go to the game by the College of Food and Natural Resources.
And you want to be invited back again someday too. So absolutely.
I do. Yes, I'm going to wear my Stanford sweatshirt, by the way, just to be ornery.
But you know, you don't just watch sporting events. I mean,
No.
one of the most amazing things about you is these feats of physical endurance that you do on a daily basis. It's not just the physical side, that it takes more and more mental energy to do these things at the level you do them. So talk a little bit how you got into the competitive stuff that you're into.
And this is probably why I'm so hard on my football teams. So I do Ironman triathlon. So that ultimate is a 2.5 mile swim, 112 mile bike, and then a marathon. And the way I got into it was I was always a runner. I mean, I did sports a lot in high school, even though I'm really shrimpy. I'm like 5'3", 110 pounds. So I always had to play high school I had to play sports in high school because we were such a small school. We barely had enough girls for a volleyball team. So I did a lot of running, and I did running just for fun when I was at Stanford. So I was always a runner, and I got a little bit injured in the hip at one point when I was sort of mid 30s because I also had a horse, and I was trail riding, and I kind of bailed off into some grass because he was bucking. And so I kind of had a little hip challenge. So someone told me to start swimming. So I started swimming and biking. And by the time I got to running, I had friends inviting me to do a triathlon with them. So I did the running part, and I sat there the rest of the day watching these people saying, these people are insane. Why are they doing this? And that was for one that is 1/6 the length of an Ironman. I was saying, these people are nuts. How can they do it? And by another 18 months later, I was doing half Ironmans, and I've done 10 full Ironmans, mostly in Florida, Cozumel, Wisconsin, and in Arizona. I did the Arizona Ironman. And if you get first in your age group at an Ironman, you get to go to Kona, to Hawaii, to the national championship. And I've been third, and I've been third, and I've been second, and I've been 13th, but I've never been first. So next year I'm going to Ironman Mount Tremblant in Quebec, Canada. And the Ironman Corporation has graciously given 100 additional female spots to Kona, to that event. So if I get in the top 4 in my very old age group, I will likely get to go to Hawaii and compete in a really hot, horrible, windy course with lots of fast people. So I don't know why we sign up for this torture, but it does sharpen the mind and you can eat a lot more because you're exercising all the time.
And just another reason I feel kinship with you. You know, I'm a mountain climber, or peak bagger, so I'm often on high peaks in the middle of nowhere, no trails, going through a mile of brambles just to stand on a rock that no one really cares about.
That's kind of how policy works there, Andrew. You know,
well,
that's how policy works.
You know, and that brings us to the next part of the discussion here too. I mean, you're sitting there as executive director of Agrigrowth, but there had to have something had to have happened between DC and that period. Why don't we chat a little bit out there? Why don't you tell us what happened at that point?
Sure. Well, and I think part of it must just be I'm good at bringing people together, and even if they're on different sides of an issue or different sides of the aisle. And I think maybe that's because I'm the middle child, oldest girl, you know, a family of 6. Or that I went to boarding school with kids from all over the world. But when we were in Washington, D.C. at the National Center, and then at the International Policy Council within that center, we were bringing together people from both sides of the aisle to talk about ag policy. Economically, what's the right thing to do? Okay, there are always things that sound good, or payments that sound good to farmers, but like economically, what was the best way to go with farm programs? So it's probably not surprising I was there during the freedom to farm and, you know, getting rid of farm subsidies. Some of my best friends in the world are the ones in New Zealand that completely eliminated farm programs in 1984, worked in international trade negotiations in a small nonprofit that fostered dialogue between the countries. And then we traditionally had like former trade ambassadors or former ag ministers on this group, and we would all get together in a different country and we'd talk about what can we do or say to get the French and the Americans and the Canadians in agreement on wheat policy. And then you'd go to all the other commodities, because typically agriculture was kind of what held up the big agreements where you try to lower tariffs and support around the world so you could have more free flow of goods. And then from then, I just fortunately, after getting my business degree, I had studied a lot more about marketing and overseas marketing, and went out to Illinois to the Farm Bureau and worked there for 20 years, taking farmers on international trips and marketing trips, fun things like that, bringing people together who maybe disagreed on policy, try to find the right way forward, but also to bring companies and farmers together. So that was the era of, I think, ADM was being investigated for price fixing. Cargill purchased Continental. There's a lot of concentration going on, and there was a big tendency by farmers to just blame all these other things for their problems. And I kept saying, that's not what that company's doing, or there's a reason IBP is doing this, or there's a reason, farmland wants to have that kind of contract. So I would bring, because I knew all the companies, I would bring the companies or the trade experts, I would bring them to the Farm Bureau and we'd have them as speakers. And
That's so valuable. I mean,
it was fun.
not even in agriculture, anywhere. It's just, there's
Yes.
so much isolation and there's so much red team, blue team stuff that it's difficult to bring around a common cause. So I really applaud you for doing that. And then let me ask you a quick question.
Yeah.
You said that a little bit of wheat policy on the international trade side. Did you by any chance run into Shannon back then when he was doing his wheat work, or was that when you got back to Minnesota?
His name was so incredibly familiar, but we knew some of the same people because the U.S. Wheat Associates were not members of the International Policy Council, but I knew a lot of their folks. And then when I was in Illinois, we actually managed the Illinois Wheat Association, but not until after Shannon had kind of left the industry. But I certainly had heard his name, and we often find that we know a lot of people in common.
The great ones always do.
Yeah, and I will tell you, I don't remember if I ever told Shannon this story, but during that international time, I was actually sitting in the room after dinner with a group of people and their wives, and it was the guy who was the Minister of Agriculture in Argentina, the guy who was one of the ag ministers in France, the guy who was the ag minister in Canada, and the guy who was the undersecretary for ag in Minnesota, or in Illinois, sorry, nationally, but he's from Michigan. The four of them went back to that day when we had the embargo against Russia over their invasion of Afghanistan. There was the wheat embargo and no one would sell wheat to Russia, but I think Argentina and Canada broke the agreement. France and the US stayed together and Argentina and Canada started selling. And these four guys just suddenly decided to have a slight argument about that after they had had a couple of glasses of wine. It was like literally the four people, and each one tried to explain what was going on in his country, what pressures were being applied to him, why they stepped out and went ahead and sold. And it was very interesting to see how at first, they're blustering and they're beating their chests and they're mad. And by the end, they're like, I totally understand, patting you on the back. You had a tough political situation. And it was just fascinating to me how quickly you could go from complete argument and misunderstanding of something that happened 20 years ago to best buddies again. I totally get it. If I was wearing your shoes, I would have done the same thing. Yeah.
Well, and also how it ties back into Peter Zion.
Yes.
That's what started the Arab Spring right there.
Yep.
I mean, and that was a very consequential moment in time, and you were in that room right there.
Yes.
It's interesting how the great ones, Shannon and Allison, and all of our lives, time to time just weave together from one thing to another at different points, and maybe known or unknown to us. But anyway, back to how you got to be sitting in the Agrigrowth executive director chair. This is a fascinating story. Thank you.
Okay, so I was at Illinois, and my husband's and my family are here in Minnesota, and there are a lot of great opportunities here in Minnesota. I was really kind of ready to get out of the Farm Bureau system. I'd been at Illinois Farm Bureau for 20 years. I had pretty much risen as high as I could rise, and our parents were here, and you see them getting older. And people tell you, they tell you stories when they're 50 or 60, and then you're younger and you're like, yeah, that's never going to happen to me. My parents are so healthy. And then you start getting to that age and you're like, oh my gosh, My mom can't drive. My dad doesn't do this right. So we felt a compulsion to come home. And so I, through the gracious help of a wonderful person at Country Financial, which the Illinois Farm Bureau is affiliated with, she said something to me about, didn't you guys want to have a get together about your pension? And I said, oh, yeah, but I can't retire until XYZ date because of this healthcare benefit. She said, well, why don't we keep our June 1st meeting, because I'd really like to tell you about how this works. And then we got together and I realized that if I retired in the fall of 2018, I would technically have 20 years in from the date I started, that the Farm Bureau would cover 2/3 of my medical premium until I turned 65. That's Blue Cross Blue Shield. Now that's a story about Illinois in and of itself, because they were competing against State Farm, Illinois Wesleyan, Illinois State, Firestone, and Mitsubishi North America. So of course they had a pension plan, and of course they had really good benefits. And so I retired from Illinois Farm Bureau. And in the process of thinking through this, I happened to talk to Dave Flackney at Syngenta, who I've known for years, just like I've known many friends at Cargill and Land O'Lakes and other companies. And Dave was talking about this great cabin they had in Wisconsin. We were talking about great retirement areas and yada, yada. We're talking about Florida versus Arizona. And about a week, I said to Dave something like, yeah, I'd really like to work a couple more years, but I can't seem to break through in Minnesota. I saw this Syngenta sales job. I was going to ask you about that. And he said, no, that's not for you. He said, let me tell you, I got just the job for you. And he said, Perry Osnes took a job with Compeer and he's leaving Agrigrowth. You need to apply for this job at Agrigrowth. And that was how in August 2018, I heard about Agrigrowth. I had never heard of it. And I applied and they interviewed me and I got the job and I was thrilled. And I moved here February 1st of 2019 and it snowed 60 inches in the next 50 days.
That's the white welcome mat, they call it, Goodness. And speaking of storms and moving, last year at the Space Agriculture Conference that the Grand Farm did, and they had all the tents. This was a big deal event, and that freak blizzard came through in April, and but they, to give them credit, because I was hybrid. I wasn't there physically. It did not impact at all my viewing, the speakers, any kind of interaction I had with them at that point in time. But that's one of those wild cards out west there that you got to worry about. But fortunately, you just had a big event, and I didn't see any weather issues that at least that I noticed. And
Fargo did. Fargo had 13 inches, I think, the night before. But no, and thanks for asking. That's our Ag and Food Summit. We have it every fall. It's almost always the Wednesday after the election Tuesday. So it's quite an interesting time.
And I assume that's intentional given your background, right?
Yes, that's intentional given kind of Agrigrowth sort of involvement in public policy and advocacy. It presents a little bit of dicey political situation from time to time, but this year it worked out fine. In fact, we had announced at lunch that it was actually Hillary Myers from Cargill was our session opener, and she had to announce that unfortunately Governor Walz wouldn't be there, but we had a video and she made a really funny story about how, she can imagine the campaign trail is grueling based on her running for FFA president 20 years ago. And it was very cute. And literally afterwards, someone ran up from the governor's office and told me, oh, actually, he is driving to Montana with his college daughter who flew home to vote for him. Now he's taken some windshield time and driving back to Montana with her. And I said, well, can I please tell the audience that, because everybody in agriculture understands what windshield time is. And so we did. But it was a great event. In addition to message from Governor Walz, he's typically there in person. We had Senator Amy Klobuchar, Senator Tina Smith, talked a little bit about what they're hoping to achieve in the next farm bill and some priorities on biofuels and things, trade. And we also had some really neat sessions. We had the black sheep cousin of Peter Zion, Dan Kowalski from CoBank, who has not dismissed the global market and does not believe we're all going to isolate ourselves into silos. And he talked a bit about global markets and their importance to ag, but he actually just talked a lot about interest rates and inflation. And I think I heard him even encourage the audience that if we want less inflation, people need to stop running around and spending all their money, because that's really seems to be driving this kind of ongoing economic tornado that keeps going. And I heard it again today that people are expected to spend way more on Christmas gifts and holiday things this year than they
Right.
did in
Good
the
luck
past.
telling consumers what they should do, right?
Yeah, exactly. But you know, Andrew, we did not have a cybersecurity session this year like we did last year, but which is how you and I met. But we did have a really neat one on the supply chain, on kind of ag supply chain and what are they learning and what are still challenges. We had one on animal disease.
Well, back to the supply chain, did you
Yeah,
focus on any part of it? Because again, I biased the gate backwards.
yeah.
Everything that's outside the gate, I'm learning as I go. Was there any particular point that you felt was important? And also, what were some of the outcomes or findings?
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things was the people who spoke talking about the level of trust. We were all expecting to say, oh, well, we added redundancies to our chain and, we're still having problems or we've completely switched to sourcing from here. But what they really talked about was the development of the relationships with their suppliers. So certainly they've maybe built some redundancies or certainly they've maybe adjusted some of their supplies, but they actually talked a lot more about that building that relationship of trust and how that was so important to their supply chain and to really anything they expect out of their supply chain. If they expect carbon neutrality or they expect certain food safety. And that was really neat because it's like building community, right? And then they also talked about a lot about workforce issues. So, it was moderated by the Minnesota Trucking Association and CHS and Hormel were on the panel. I mean, you can have a lot of supply chain issues because maybe China's not completely open yet if you're sourcing parts or things from there. But boy, when you get right back here to the United States and you can't find anybody to drive a truck, that's an issue. And then so we of course talked about robotics and automatic trucks, which are being used by the sugar beet growers this year up in northwestern Minnesota and in North Dakota. But they're mainly using them on their plant site. They're not driving them on the highways. They're using them within their plant site to move things around.
And this might be a third rail. Any visa discussions?
Yes, we did. And I can't remember if it was in the panel prep, but we talked about some of the visa programs. And actually, I believe Senators Klobuchar and Smith both mentioned that need for immigration and visa reform. And there's so many different ones within the ag sector. But I think it's possibly going to be a really good time to talk about immigration reform in the next 4 years. The hardest part is that, and even during the Trump administration, there was quite a bit of discussion by then President Trump at ag events about streamlining the ag visa programs. And
I remember that several times he said that. I mean, he was clear in New Orleans.
Yep. And making it more, traceable, so if you make it more legal and you make it more streamlined, then it's easier to follow and to track, maybe when you have folks that aren't supposed to be here. But obviously, if you have fighting amongst political party or one person's trying to claim the victory over another, I hope, like on the infrastructure bill, I hope our politicians and our leaders will realize that accomplish something for the whole country. Doesn't really matter what side you're on. And then like when it's done and accomplished, don't complain about it because the other side happened to be in power when you achieved it. Because it's, it's sometimes really a mystery to other countries. They sort of sit back and laugh at us when they see that, we didn't invest in our locks and dams on the Mississippi for 90 years. There's some 90-year-old wooden gate
I know
at a lock that's holding all the water back. And they're just like, what?
Well, and we also have the Jones Act on the books,
Yes.
From the 1920s. I mean, there's some ludicrous things going on out there that stand in the way of us taking care of our own country, our own citizens.
There are. It's amazing. But hopefully we'll have some progress, and we've got some great Minnesota leadership that'll be, I think, on the House Ag Committee and on the Senate Ag Committee. So, and Michigan does as well. So, keeping our fingers crossed. I know we had a question earlier about the Farm Bill, and I think that's I thought I knew what maybe they were going to do 4 weeks ago, and at which time I would have said, I think they're going to work really hard on trying to help mitigate risk due to climate issues and also to provide some incentives to do practices, right, that will help mitigate climate or water.
Yeah, I mean, all the
Yeah.
rational things. I think they
Yeah.
also want to watch Mexico drive off the cliff and see what the aftermath looks like then too, to see if the government can still stand after this disastrous decision they made.
Oh yeah, on biotech to not bring in our, yeah. I mean, but I think the thing is, then as you got close to the election and you had a lot of confidence by the Republicans that they were going to win or have a big wave, then they started to automatically say, well, we're not going to do any climate change adjustment because, when we're in power, we're not going to do that. And I'm sitting there thinking, wait a minute, the farmers are already in the ark ready to do a whole bunch of these things. We were this close to getting it into a farm bill, and let's reward and incentivize, because otherwise you just have regulations. But if it's a practice and you can reward and incentivize and show that it works, and you have universities working to see that, yes, these cover crops are adding this value to your soil, or holding nitrogen, whatever it is, you go with it. You don't like put your stick in the ground and say, this isn't true, we're not going to follow it. Because you've got a lot of farmers now that one of their biggest worries is always weather. Now it's really their big worry. We didn't have any rain here really in Minnesota between June and August. Maybe we had an inch. And guess what? We still had 300 bushels to the acre corn in many, many, many areas. And that's genetics, that's biotechnology. And so I think farmers and ag leaders are ready to talk about what is a really good farm policy look like. So now I think that we've got a different balance maybe in Washington than people thought. Hopefully there'll be a lot more room for working together. And I'm sure our Minnesota congressmen and women and senators will be a part of the solution. So I think that's part of our job here in Minnesota, right?
It is. And since this is my webinar and only 12 people are going to watch it if we're lucky. So
I'll send the link to my mom, and then if my whole family
that's
watches,
it. And I'll send it to my
18.
parents too. Like my mom will say, "Oh, it's an hour long. I only watched 12 minutes or something."
We should have told more jokes.
Well, back to the Farm Bill. So I'm assuming a member benefit of being an Agrigrowth is they get exposure to your insights, your thoughts, your perspective, your networks, the things you might hear behind doors that are closed about the Farm Bill and how to influence to best suit the needs of the members of Agrigrowth. I'm assuming that's a fringe benefit, or maybe that's the intended featured benefit. Talk about what does a prospective member gain from joining Agrigrowth as around the Farm Bill?
Yeah, absolutely. We always seek input from our members on our policy initiatives. And so for next year's policy priorities, if you will, for the state and national level, we are specifically asking our members now. So they're responding either to a survey that we sent them late this summer, and we just sent it out again yesterday, or they can come in person and be at our policy priority session. So the nice thing there is if you might have a really general policy on farm policy, and it looks good and it says certain things, but you might feel like the ball's getting far enough down the court, you better say, and farmers should be compensated, or practices to protect the environment should be incentivized. You go ahead and you try to put that language in there so that as people are working on the policy in St. Paul or Washington, D.C., they'll go, oh yeah, corn growers, soybeans, Agrigrowth, pork producers, Farm Bureau, they all support that. Now we have a coalition of the willing we can talk to. So it's a great opportunity for folks to put their priorities for it. And it's also where we find the intersections sometimes between engineering companies, water district managers, and farmers to all have the same achievement, whether it's on the water quality or the water quantity, or whether water's coming from or going to. If they all are on the same side of a solution, it makes it a lot easier to get that forward.
That's amazing. I mean, a simple analogy here is everyone talks about knowing where the puck is going. The puck is going to go there. Not only do you know where the puck is going, you're applying subtle pressure to that puck to deliver it in a place that you want it to be, and you fill the stands with all your friends. So, you've rigged the game to the best of your abilities to represent Agrigrowth. That's that again. I don't mean to overemphasize that, but that's incredibly sophisticated.
Well, I think that's like in my personal way of acting, I'm very much a hammerhead shark. I'm very much, nope, this is where we want to go. This is how you get there. Now either lead, follow, or get out of the way, because that's the way we're going. I don't often have to adjust course because usually there's so much that's spun around in my little brain before I point to where we're going that I've already considered all those other things that people throw out. So I would say that, like, in my job, the thing that's really different is I'm much more inclusive and looking for other ideas, because the thing I find is you might not like the idea, or you might not like where they're going with it in terms of a policy, but you're going to see a thread in what they're saying that matches what your other constituents want. And then if you can just make the connections to someone else that can talk to that person and find the commonality, then you can all move forward. I mean, it's really, I always laugh because really politics are not that divisive that you see on TV. It's a lot more backslapping and handshaking and I agree with you comments than I think the average person realizes. The stuff that's on TV and in the media, that's kind of like your Facebook page. So are you going to put the worst picture from your kid's wedding on Facebook? Are you going to put the time they fumbled and the whole team lost? No, you're going to put the stuff that you want to, like, show who you think you are or show who you think people want you to be. Your college diploma or your graduation or the dance contest you won. And that's exactly how people in politics tend to have to act. They have to always be shining off their coat lapels and showing that to the people who are voting for them, rather than the kind of hard work they had to do reach across the aisle.
No, that's well stated. I do want to go back to another thing you said before. After the session there, you mentioned pathogens. I mean, this is obviously something I'm very interested in as well. What came of that discussion? And,
Yeah,
and
so
are the specific ones you were talking about as well?
Yeah, so the animal disease conversation we had was really good because the College of Veterinary Medicine at the University of Minnesota volunteered the session. We were thinking about having something more about animal activism and how those kind of pieces of legislation at a state level can really, or with one organization like the Humane Society of the US, those can really actually, A, not be good, not be better for the animal, and B, they really cause trouble in the agricultural food system. And they're really not based on science. So we thought that was going to be what it was about. But the College of Veterinary Medicine said, no, we really would like to talk about a couple things. One is how an animal disease outbreak affects the entire chain, not just the livestock producers, but the grain producers, the shippers and haulers, the meat companies, and consumers. But it also affects consumers' ability to choose between competing meats because of prices. And then sometimes when all the prices go up, because you're having a disease challenge here and a market challenge there, consumers might even be more tempted to try something else, protein-based plants, for example. So, I mean, I know we may have ground hamburger, we may have ground turkey, we may have ground pork in our freezer, but we also almost always have veggie burgers because we inevitably end up having somebody that comes to a barbecue that wants a veggie burger. So there's a lot of competing proteins that get attention out of an animal disease
Well, I'm going to give a
outbreak.
shout out here. I love the Morningstar veggie sausage
Oh,
links.
I used to
I
always eat
chop them
those.
up and I scramble in my eggs. I do, put some cheese on top. But
Yep.
the flavor profiles, they balance nicely, and I
Yep.
appreciate them.
There's a lot of good products out there now. And, but they also talked about, Andrew, which is super important and it really gets into the weeds, but it's something that it needs to be kind of constantly flashing there in the back of their mind, is that interaction between animals and humans. I mean, that is where SARS came and COVID came from. And it is something that will happen again and again and again. And so it's not just learning about Susie the
Well, the
tiger in
flu
New
from
York. Yeah.
1900s,
Yes.
1919.
Yes.
I mean, that started in Leavenworth, Kansas. I
Yep.
mean, it started on pig farm. That was the initial leap there.
So
And
they
then the other
talked a
piece.
lot about that.
Well, good. And then the other one too, I know the foot and mouth disease. There was a really set of tabletop exercises done after the initial Al-Qaeda was taken down, and it wasn't just the consumption of the food. The secondary impact was on local law enforcement because they have to start putting perimeters out, and that taxes their ability to respond to other things. I mean, it's the rippling effect of something like this, and why I want to really get into this. And you mentioned the animal activists as well. There was a recent ruling between DXE and Smithfield in Utah that did not favor the animal protein industry, and it appears from what I'm seeing to embolden a lot of animal activists and extremists who feel for whatever reason they need to rescue animals from a farm or steal someone else's property, and whatever their motivation, what they don't understand is biosecurity, because they're
Yep.
not wearing booties, they're not soaking their feet when they leave. They're going from one farm to another, and with ASF
SF.
just blazing away across Asia and some of the island areas closer to home. This is a terrifying, and that's not even to mention the avian
Right.
issues, because I saw that Sparbo and
Yep.
somebody else was a part of that session as well.
Yes, yes. Sparbo and Ecolab and Minnesota Turkey helped sponsor
Minnesota
that
turkey, that
session.
was it. Yeah.
Christensen Farms. Yeah, and that is, and Ecolab is kind of in that funny in between space, because not only do they make a lot of the products we use for hand sanitizers and also in food safety production, but they also are getting more into that animal ag area. And so it's, animals, mammals are the closest species, or closest, what is it, kingdom, phylum. They're the closest to humans, and so things that can pass among animals could eventually make it into the human population. And those kinds of things are really important to understand, because like you mentioned, Andrew, it's complicated to track and stop a disease once it's started. And so we're all kind of like, okay, well, thank heavens, they had that flu back in the early 1900s, and now we've had COVID and we're done except for the annual food. No, it's just beginning. And whether global travel or animal activists or just animals and people moving around, more people being close together as we come out of COVID, I think it's a very interesting, intricate interaction. And it's something that we need to know about. So it's an important session that we had there.
And this is one of those times when you're watching C-SPAN where they say, okay, we're going to private session at this point, so we'll follow up, but it won't be public. So let me tell you, let me put it that way.
Yeah.
Two other things on the agenda I do want to touch. One, I saw that there was a reimagining of Minnesota's food,
Yes.
and before you respond, I hold Minnesota, I hold you, the CPG community out in the upper Midwest, especially Minnesota, as being the best in the country. And I'm really struggling to understand what is it that you want to reimagine, because right now it seems that you're hitting on all cylinders and you're blazing a path forward for others to follow.
It's the toughest thing is that, and I came into agriculture as a woman, and it was interesting because when you come into whether the Farm Bureau system or the international trade, it was all men, and it was typically men older than me. And there were a few women who were kind of like rock stars that were out there, Carol Brookins, Ann Veneman, there were these folks, and you got to know them. They were trade negotiators or whatever. But 40 years ago, there weren't very many of us ladies, and then it became a lot more women. So I would say agriculture now, maybe not a county farm bureau meeting, but the rest of ag, it's going to be at least 40% women now, 60% men. But they're also throughout agriculture. I saw more Latino, African American, and Asian participants when I was at international trade negotiations in agriculture than ever if I showed up at a food and ag meeting in the United States. And that's because of the global markets and the international trade. Now you go to any event outside of ag, and it's very diverse. A lot of ag meetings tend to be still not that diverse. A lot of corn, a lot of soybeans, pork, beef, turkey. But boy, it's much more diverse than that. It's just maybe the members that you have. So what we tried to do was say, who are the producers out there, and how are their needs or what they're doing different than your commodity producers? And in some sense, does that way of farming, does that offer an opportunity for maybe somebody who doesn't want to get 150 acres out near Faribault and do corn and soybean production? Maybe their background is in fruits and vegetables. And so you get into that reimagine section, and we had among farmer, African American and Indigenous, Angela Dawson is both. And we also had Reginaldo, who is Latino, but I believe he's from Guatemala. We had a last minute replacement. And when they look at what does a farm do, they look at it really differently. They don't say, oh, I need to run down to Faribault and buy 150 acres. They're happy if they can get a 10-acre plot close to Woodbury Marina on St. Croix, St. Paul, because they're going to grow vegetables through the summer months and supply into, either local markets or a farmer's market or a processing plant maybe. And so how they look at things in terms of farm programs, services from the state Department of Ag or the federal is even risk management. It's much different than a large corn and soybean farmer. And there's nothing wrong with either one. It's just that they're very different. And the smaller farmers here and our ethnic farmers have their own events. They have their emerging farmer conference 2 days after ours, but yet they had so many poignant things to say that I think all of our farmers attending that conference and all of our business people really appreciated, because they basically, in talking about what happens to them and how they're trying to be successful, it gave lessons to the rest of us.
Many years ago, I helped start a nonprofit. It was a leadership class for rising professionals. And once we put it together, we realized there was one component that was missing that we needed to have in anyone in a role of leadership, and that was empathy, to understand what it meant to be in someone else's position. And this is another reason why I applaud you. You kindly invited me to sit in for part of your board meeting recently. But it wasn't just a board meeting at some high, big glass building with people that wait on you with folded towels over their wrists. No, we were at Second Harvest.
And then
after lunch, we went out and I filled bags of rice. Actually, I didn't fill the rice. I stamped the rice and then positioned them and tested them before they went in the box to be delivered. But this is just a tiny little indication of all the things that are in coordination right now. And another reason why the rest of the country really envies what you've done up there. And going back to the reimagine piece here, this is not a bug. This is the feature of what it is that you do. Before I go to the next part, talk a little bit about the coordination you do with Canada, because you and I are both close friends with many people in Canada, and we appreciate the agriculture, innovation, and just the friendship of folks across the border. How does Agrigrowth work with Canada?
Wow, great question, because I just had a call last night from Sam Ziegler at Green Seam. They're doing a really neat program on December 1st down in Mankato, and they're going to have the consuls general from Canada and Mexico talking a little bit about our cross-border trade. And I think Tom Peterson from the Department of Ag is on as well. Those two countries are really Minnesota's top two markets and trading partners. I mean, we certainly import a lot of things like silicon chips and things from Taiwan and many products from other countries. But, in terms of ag and food and our integration with those two markets, whether it's because of geography or weather or the types of other income sources for those countries like Mexico, it's tourism. We also buy a lot of oil from Mexico and Canada. We work, interestingly, we have actually, the Canadian consulate is a member of Agrigrowth. And so we work together on a lot of cross-border issues like workforce, animal disease, trucking issues, and also trade. If we have a dispute, we work together. And with Mexico, same thing. We don't always agree on everything. We may not, our dairy farmers may not all agree with Canada about their dairy policy. And similarly, I think most of us disagree with Mexico's attempt to keep out biotech crops. It's about 20 years too late and $3,000 underfunded. But that was something where Mexico and Mexico's farmers looked at this, 20 years ago when NAFTA was being signed and said, we're going to need some of this technology someday, so we better not try to keep it out. Now they're just saying, well, let's just keep it out because it'll keep our domestic prices higher. It has nothing to do with safety.
No, it makes no sense.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at Sri Lanka, they went from an upper middle class country that made a huge amount of money of selling tea, and they grew enough rice to feed themselves. And in 1 year, that entirely collapsed from just almost an identical mindset from the leadership. And now they've already killed all the politicians. I mean, they're running wild down there. I don't know what's going on in Sri Lanka, but that worries me. That's going to happen in Mexico on our southern border.
Eventually, when you're making stuff up, your whole house of cards is going to collapse. But Mexico, is my Canada and Mexico are also my two favorite countries, and I go to both, but I go to Mexico a lot. And but our group, we would love to be down at this event on December 1st. I was at it last year. I would love to moderate the discussion on this topic because, none of our countries, as good as we are at lots of things, are an island. And so, for example, in the United States, we produce way more food and agricultural products than we need. And so it's much better for us to have outlets. And in some cases, Canada might produce the wheat, and that may somebody give someone here that produces wheat angst. But boy, we bring it in, it goes to Hershey, Pennsylvania, somewhere else, Michigan, they process it into pasta, and we sell it back to Canada. Okay, which one did you make more of a margin on? It's not on growing the wheat, gentlemen and ladies. It's made on processing it and selling the branded good back to them. So we do a lot of that with Canada, Mexico. Most of our companies have cross-border arrangements and contracts, and so do all the ag groups. All the ag associations here have good relationships with our buyers in those countries. And also they're a great source of items for us when we're in need. Notably, I think the Mexicans completely bailed us out in 2008 with buying products from us. They may even have had a peso crisis, but still, because of the structure and strength of the North and South American hemisphere, or North and Central, we have good partners and actually two very safe borders.
We do. You know, you and I are reading from the same
Mhm.
hymn book, so we know where we're going with this. So kind of wrapping up your event was a panel on the future, and I think that kind of leads us into the next area as well. Talk a little about some of the findings there, but also I want to hear about the plans for 2023. Where do you see Agrigrowth? Obviously, the Farm Bill is going to be a big part of what goes on, or maybe it's not. I don't know. But why don't you tell me a little bit again what the outcomes were from the event and the future panel, as well as tomorrow's Agrigrowth?
Yeah, so on the summit itself, we had almost 400 people there. That's the largest audience we've had probably since 2017. Clearly, people want to get back together in person, so that was great. But we also did a lot of promoting, and we also did a lot of effort to make it inclusive. It's not always easy to walk into any kind of a big professional event and feel like you have someone to talk to, or who do I network with? And so it was fun. It was fast moving. We had a lot of different topics. And I had several people call me this morning and say, that's the best networking event that we have. So that was great. We also covered some topics that maybe wouldn't have been traditional with the reimagined Minnesota food production, and then some of the new hemp pea protein meats and some other products.
Oh, I missed that.
Yeah,
well, we got a few minutes here on the clock. Talk a little bit about that. That's interesting.
So we had a new and innovative kind of food product panel, and we had pea protein meats, which are really, the texture is really like a muscle cut. And it's not like, okay, we're making this pea protein meat over here, we don't think you should eat meat. These folks are making it for the markets that want a vegetable-based protein, like India or Sri Lanka or Malaysia, where they just eat more plant-based protein. And so, yeah, they'll probably sell it here, and you and I will be able to try it as a steak, the pea protein steak. But it's kind of neat that they're right here in Minnesota. And we also had a hemp. So we had hemp acres from Laconia. We had Northern Diversified, which is here in Burnsville. We had ADM has a noble grain, kind of a branch where they're doing some nutritional products that have some unique features in them, like hemp seeds and things. And then the hemp acres and hemp acres and Northern Diversified, I might be getting them wrong. They both do products that are based out of hemp, some of which have CBD in them. So it's very interesting, because it's a very structured, heavily regulated, how you have to, it's basically a controlled substance, even if it's not in all the products. So that's really interesting. And then nowadays, which actually does the pea protein meat. So that nowadays is out of California, but they have an office here. So really neat products, and just the way they talked about, whatever their goals are, community development, sustainability, regenerative practices, climate friendly practices. It's kind of one of those new product areas, new ag areas that tries to encapsulate all the trends that are coming at them, whether it's climate friendliness, community, sense of community, healthy product. I guess we could make an argument on the hemp-based ones, but no, hemp seeds, hemp oil is super healthy. So a lot of great info at that. Nice to see the young faces of a couple of former Cargill and ADM execs or leaders working on those new products, and to hear their passion for that area. So what we learned about this for next year is, I think that people prefer a little bit of a shorter session. So we're not going to do hour and 15-minute session anymore. It seems like 45 minutes is kind of what people want. We want to make sure we leave time for people to go around to the exhibits. And what a couple of people said is they'd like even more of a, even if it was a little bit of a forced interaction, like, you know, let's all break into groups and have to go discuss this, you know, maybe right before the cocktail reception. So that was kind of neat. Hearing that maybe even next year they'd like something more interactive. And then also just they were saying, you know, great to see these new faces and these young people and these new products, and we're all a part of the food system. And so it's good for us to make those connections. So that was always great. And I think they appreciate the opportunity to hear from political leaders. So I'm sure we will keep that as a part of our program for next year. To me, it'll be much easier because it's not going to be an election year. Because sometimes, like we had our poor election update guys, Bloy Solson and Randy Russell, one from locally here and one from Washington, D.C. And they literally like practically had to stay up all night on Tuesday and then do whatever they had to do on Wednesday. And then they both came in Thursday morning to our event. But you know what? They still had their PowerPoint slides and everything ready to go with their observations about kind of what happened and why, and what does it mean for ag policy.
And that's a delicate dance, and you do it well. I mean, we were out in Fargo for the Fargo Moorhead Chamber of Commerce, and Hovind and Klobuchar were both on stage together. But the beautiful and Michelle Fishbach was there too. And the neat thing about that was everyone puts their swords and shields down and says, "Here's what we're doing for agriculture and the rural communities." And that I really appreciated that too. It wasn't red tie, blue tie, or red scarf, blue scarf type of stuff. And again, that goes back to the heart of what you do so well: is bringing people together around a common cause, saying, "Here's the North Star. Put the weapons outside the door. I don't care if you pick them up when you go out there, but right now we're going to be focusing on getting this thing done in the future." And speaking of that, so the 2023, what can we expect? What should we look for? What should we tell our friends about? What is Agrigrowth going to do?
You know, I think you should tell your friends that, you know, if you're going to go to one ag and food related event a year, you should definitely make the Agrigrowth one part of the agenda. You know, we have a fun night before reception at Brits Pub, just down the street from the convention center, or just by the Hilton in downtown Minneapolis. It's great venue. I walked out of it and I walked right out onto the street, and Mike Max, we call him Maxie. He's the big newscaster here who does the sports reporting here in Minnesota. And he was also conscripted into service during the riots after George Floyd was murdered. He had to report on the street as things were going on. I don't know if they were trying to take the women out of the agenda on that newscast, or if they had a lot of coverage by their female newscaster, and they brought Mike Max in, and he did just a fabulous job. And I walked out of Brits Pub and there's Mike Max walking down the street from WCCO. So I stopped and chatted with him, told him what a great job he does, compared some notes because we have some common friends. I don't know anywhere else in the world you can walk up to a major sports news broadcaster on the street and just talk to him at 8
Well, let me
o'clock
ask
at
you
night.
this: did he pull out his iPhone and start recording the conversation?
You know, at first I called him Mr. Max, which is actually his father's name. And that's, I think, what made him stop and smile at me. But then when I told him I was from the next town over from his and that my cousins went to school with him, he's like, "Oh yeah, big family." But no, I think too, you know, that Brits Pub event is great networking. We get students there from Mankato and from the U of M, but we also get agency people. We get past and current legislators, and we get big name agricultural folks there, as well as some of the innovators. But then that next day, I mean, we've got everyone from FFA kids and college students to CEOs of major companies to academic deans at the University of Minnesota to animal disease experts, and they come from all over the state. And we even had about 4 people from Fargo Moorhead. So it was, in fact, we had someone from Bushel, Andrew, and a couple of Grand Farms people that didn't end up making it, but Northern Crops Institute. So it's a whole state adventure, and it begins and ends with fun and laughter. And I think we keep it moving. And I hope we do our best to help folks network with each other.
And I think beyond that, I think a lot of us, we appreciate that the next generation and the generations beyond that are involved as well. That they not only understand agriculture, but they understand how important it is, whether they pursue a career in ag or not. And I think that Anne-Marie Ward, who you introduced me to at your board
Yeah.
meeting, really exemplifies that. The more I did my diligence on that organization, the more, again, it just goes back to Minnesota leading the country in a lot of different areas. It seems that she really has created and constructed a fantastic to let the next generation come up here and start assuming those roles that we're doing now. And so I want to again thank Minnesota, thank you guys, thank Anne Marie. And
Well, I tell you, that ag in the classroom stuff is unbelievable. And, I have probably 3 or 4 either siblings or nieces and nephews that teach at public schools here in Minnesota. And I am forever sending them those. And I tell you what, a lot of Anne Marie's items in 2020 were videos. So they did a visit to the farm by video. And those things were hugely popular during COVID, because I would be sending them to my nieces and my sister-in-law, and they'd be like, oh, awesome, because I can pick this up, tie it to something we were talking about, biology or food, and I can pop that video up. Or maybe we're talking about animals today. So yeah, they do great work. And it's a really important thing for people to understand ag and food and animals, because it all ties back to your health. I mean, as you and I know, a lot of our time when we're not on Zoom screens is we're outside, or we're doing, we're chopping brush, or we're hiking through it. And we're choosing our food choices based on what we learn from our profession and from farms and from nutritionists and experts we get to be around. Most people don't get to make their food choices that way. And your whole life, you might be able to live a decent amount of time, but you're not going to live it well, and you're not going to live it happily if you have life choices that, in the end of your life, create a lot of whatever it is, cancer, dementia, whatever. And your food choices are so important to that. And so I think that's kind of like our joint area of passion is, how do we make it better even than it was yesterday by the choices we make? And that's what agriculture is every day, right?
well, it is, and then again, your leadership in Agrigrowth, that's just reflective of that as well. It's all it's all the things that you do and touch that don't necessarily, maybe they're not, if there's a binary, a linear, this is the way it has to be. Leadership of the organization like you have, it could be done completely differently. But you have broadened that, and you've put the touch out there in a lot of places that I don't even think you and I maybe even recognize that the impact it's going to have.
I hope so, Andrew. I will just say many, many, many years ago, when we were bringing people together overseas on international discussions, and I was at that time like a staff assistant. I was putting the meeting together, and I'll never forget, my boss came up to me, a young woman herself, and said, that was just absolutely brilliant last night, the discussions at dinner. I mean, I don't even like, how did that even come together? And then the day before at the meeting, like, how did that work out? And I said, oh, I have the most control. I've got the tent cards, and I read all the policy papers, so I know who disagrees with who. So here's the thing is, you never put somebody from France 4 people down the table from the guy from Canada, because they can't see each other. And it's really easy to ignore each other, be rude to each other, and say things about each other when you can't see each other. But if you have to look that person in the eye, and then maybe you put the best friend of the guy looking at him in the eye next to the guy he doesn't like, then you create a kind of, oh, I can elbow bump, or my friend's over there, he can either acknowledge that what I'm saying is true, or he can be, don't do that. So I did that. And then at the dinners, because the wives came and they went out on a program on their own, and inevitably, the Canadian wife would get to be best friends with the French wife and the Argentine wife. Well, then what you do is, now you have the 3 people who are going to disagree, and their wives are friends, and you put them all together at the table. And then guess what? Suddenly the best idea for everyone becomes to either get along, but at least it becomes, maybe we're going to go to their beach house in southern France this year and get to know each other better when we're over in Europe. And then's when the conversations happen that really result in the solution. And it's kind of like just creating that opportunity for a nice cake to be baked. And that's what I like to do. I don't care if I'm ever given credit for it, but that's what I like for that. Sorry, I muted myself. Now you're muted.
Good Lord. Anyway, so what that reminds me of, and now I'm really big and you're really small.
That's okay.
Yeah, it reminds me of the manufacturer serendipity that Andrew, Jason, and I are discussing at the Grand Farm, and how not only do they do it well, but the folks in Minnesota, Allison and Shannon, yourself. I mean, you really, this is a case study. This is an MBA case study on how you're pulled this all off. So everyone else thinks it might be happenstance, but we know it was. There's a lot of intention there behind how things happen.
It takes work, you know. You can a lot of people I notice when they're planning events, they're worrying about the flowers or the colors of the tablecloths or the meal, and the meal is often important. Like, we had chicken pot pie at our event at the conference center. No, one of the reasons was our Distinguished Service Award winner. She loves their chicken pot pie. It's one of the things the convention center does really well, and it's a nice a warming dish in the fall. But a lot of people kind of joke, you know, that, oh, it's the cheap way out, you know, you should be having fish or beef. But
I'm a big fan of carrot pie. You know,
yeah,
you thought sweet potato pie was good. Try carrot pie sometime.
I mean,
It's
people
delicious.
are more comfy when they're eating a nice warm thing on it with a spoon with crust on the top, where nobody's going to do it elegantly, than if we all had to have knives and forks and multiple glasses. So I always think more about the ambiance. And I will tell you one thing. At our conference, Andrew, with these really pretty plants, these big, they kind of look like a big pineapple plant, and they're colored, but they were super high. And the one thing that they looked really pretty when you looked out on an empty room, but when you were sitting there looking at 8 people at the table, you had 3, 4 people that couldn't see each other for the plant. One of the things we noticed is that people, like, mutually agreed upon, reached and took the plant and moved it to the part of the table so it wouldn't interrupt their line of sight to their people at the table. That's community right there, caused by the plant. You know, inadvertently, just the fact that the plant was there blocking their view made them have to do something about it, which I thought was great.
And you noticed. You know, that's the other piece too, is how many people would not have even a clue what was happening there, and the success of you putting all the right people in the right room or the right table together at the right time. Well done.
I don't know. We do our best, and we welcomed our new staff person. So I got to do a shout out to Nikki Diley. She was with Agrigrowth 14 years ago as a program manager, and we got her back because of our new world and with remote work capabilities. So she's joined us, and folks will really like Nikki. And not only is she an active farmer, her brother and she run a dairy farm, and she and her husband run a fruit and vegetable farm up north near Brainerd. And but she also has 4 kids, so she gets the whole younger generation thing. She's an active farmer, University of Minnesota grad, and a veteran of Agrigrowth. So we're happy to have her here, kind of managing our membership and strategic outreach.
You guys are the best.
We hope so.
So again, we have to mark on our calendars, is it November 6th through the 9th?
November 8 and 9. November 8 and 9.
All right, good. Well, we'll put that on there now, and we'll promote the heck out of it.
Yep, absolutely. We'd love to have you. And if folks have ideas for topics, they can send them our way.
Okay, good. Well, Tamara, I'm going to